We're in for a real treat tonight, folks, I can tell you that. And it's my honor today to be here and a privilege to introduce everyone here to Andy Puzder, who's a true icon of American business, whose life has epitomized the American dream, someone who's uniquely qualified to speak on a topic that is an essential component of American exceptionalism, our capitalist free market economic system. Andy grew up in a working-class community in Russell Township, Ohio. As a youngster, he worked scooping ice cream at Baskin-Robbins, and he rose to become a CEO of a company with billions of dollars in revenue. He paid his way through college and law school with jobs in construction, landscaping, painting houses, and believe this, performing in rock and roll bands. And I think we might want to hear a little bit more about that later. Andy was the first in his family to graduate from college and to go to law school. He later was named Distinguished Alumnus of the Year by both his undergraduate school, Cleveland State, and his law school, Washington University. And we have a young man right here who's a first-year student at Washington. After law school, he had a successful law career as a trial lawyer and a corporate attorney. Among the clients he represented was Carl Karcher, the founder of Carl's Jr., the West Coast-based quick-service restaurant chain, which later became CKE Restaurants. In the late 1990s, CKE purchased the Hardee's chain, which was founded and headquartered in my home state of North Carolina. Now, I'm a longtime connoisseur of classic burgers. Classics like the Hardee's Husky, the Big Deluxe, the Big Twin, and I still live to talk about it. As a matter of fact, in 1964, and I'm not saying I'm that old, you could get a Hardee's hamburger for 10 cents, a cheeseburger for 20 cents, and French fries for 10 cents. So that's a pretty good date night, if you think about it. The acquisition of Hardee's was a considerable challenge. That was until Mr. Puzder came in and became CEO of CKE Restaurants. One of the key things he did was to revamp the menu to focus on thick burgers. In 2004, Hardee's created what it calls a monument to decadence, the Monster Thick Burger. Now, we just ate a great meal, but let's think about this. 2/3 a pound of beef, 3 slices of cheese, 4 pieces of bacon, mayonnaise on a buttered bun. Wow. Yeah. So, and here's a quote. I'd like to change it to say arugula, but I'm not. It says, if you're the romaine lettuce and raspberry vinaigrette crowd, this is not your burger. Okay? That's what Andy said. In short time, he turned around declining revenues by putting emphasis on better customer service. He explained, we stopped driving people out of the restaurants with bad service and dirty restaurants. It wasn't a very complicated formula, just basic blocking and tackling in business. In his last year as CEO, CKE's company and franchise restaurants generated $4.3 billion in sales, employing over 115,000 people worldwide. Puzder described the company as providing a stepping stone for entry-level workers towards managerial careers, whether at CKE or elsewhere. He said, there's nothing more fulfilling than seeing new and unskilled workers work their way up to managing a restaurant and things beyond. I mean, that's what the American dream is about, folks. In 2010, Mr. Puzder and David Newton co-wrote a book, Job Creation, How It Really Works and Why Government Doesn't Understand It. Amen. As an advocate of job creation, Puzder has been critical of raising the federal minimum wage, arguing that a $15 an hour minimum wage would increase costs for consumers and increase automation, leading to fewer jobs. In 2018, Andy wrote a book, The Capitalist Comeback, The Trump Boom, and the Left's Plot to Stop It. In the book, he explains how the profit motive is central to capitalism. This message is more important today, as we've heard this weekend, because young people are increasingly supporting socialism and turning away from capitalism. Not in this room. Today, Puzder often appears on business news programs, including Barney and Company. He writes for publications like the Wall Street Journal, Fox Opinion, Forbes, and many others. And most importantly, I think, because I got to see him in January, he speaks to young audiences, people around the country, about what's going on and about how important a robust business environment is to enable more and more people to achieve the American dream. So tonight, I'd like to get everybody here to give a nice TFAS welcome to our speaker tonight, Andy Puzder.
Well, thank you, David. What a great introduction. I appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me here to speak to everybody tonight. The talk I'm going to give is generally a talk I give for millennials. There's a lot of people in the audience who might be a little older than millennials, but hopefully it'll give you some ammunition when you do talk to millennials so that you can defend free markets and capitalism. As David said, I grew up as a working class kid in Cleveland, Ohio. I did aspire to be more than working class. I aspired to lift myself out of the working class. And thank God I lived in a country where there was a path, where you could work yourself out of the working class or any other class. The country that my grandfather came from, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he came here for opportunity. The country he left, there was no path. But because he came here, there was a path for me. It was an arduous path. I worked every dirty, difficult job you can think of to get through college and law school. But eventually I did become the CEO of an international corporation. I lived the American dream. Now, there isn't another country in the history of the world where a working class kid like me could have aspired to that level of success with any realistic chance of achieving it. It happened here. It happened because of the American dream. And the American dream exists because of capitalism. But today's youth seems enamored with the idea of socialism and considers capitalism an oppressive and abusive economic system. Now, why, I can't imagine. If you look at history, socialism has abjectly failed every place, everywhere, and every time it's been tried. So why on earth would today's youth be so enamored with socialism? Well, part of it's our education system. Our education system is run by progressives, which you should read as socialists, and they teach our youth socialist myths as fact. Another reason is our media complex. The media complex feeds today's youth and all the rest of us liberal ideology as entertainment on a daily basis. Now, they feed our youth liberal ideology. They tell them socialist myths are true, but they never tell them what socialism is. In fact, there was a survey by the Americans, the Survivors of Communism Memorial Foundation in 2017 that found that 69% of millennials couldn't accurately describe socialism. They love it, they just don't have any idea what it is. So when I give these talks, I always try and start with a definition of socialism just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So when we're talking about socialism, we're talking about an economic system where the building blocks of the economy, the means of production, distribution, and exchange, are owned or controlled through regulation and taxation by the state. Capitalism, of course, is an economic system where those same building blocks are owned and controlled by individuals. Well, that's simple enough. So what's the myth that kids are being fed that is so misleading them? Well, the myth is that socialism is both desirable and necessary to protect the oppressed masses from capitalist greed. That's just false. It's a myth. When I use the word myth, it's just a polite word for a lie. And I'll prove it to you. Those of you who are in business will know this. Those of you who are aspiring to be in business, you should pay attention. Because the only way you will succeed in a capitalist free market economy, the only way your business will be successful is if you meet the needs of other people, your customers and consumers in general. When I ran CKE restaurants, we didn't try and make the burgers I wanted to eat or that government elites wanted to eat. I tried to figure out what burgers you wanted to eat. In fact, we spent millions of dollars every year trying to figure out what kind of burgers you wanted, because if we didn't, our competitors would, pun intended, eat our lunch. It was our goal to find out what you wanted, let you know we had it, and that we had it at a price you could afford. This is because capitalism is a form of economic democracy. a very pure form, because you vote with every dollar you spend on what companies succeed and what companies fail. This is why Henry Ford, he didn't build cars for the kings and the queens and the earls and the dukes. He built cars for the common man and the common woman. Steve Jobs, he didn't come up with iPhones for government elites. He came up with them for all of us. That's because in a capitalist economy, consumers control the direction of the economy. I mean, think about it. Think about your local grocery store or the Amazon warehouse, right? Hundreds of thousands of products with the different color wrappings and different color presentations and different placements, and each product represents an entrepreneur trying to convince you that they have what you need at a price you can afford. This is what capitalism does. It takes your desire to improve your life and funnels it outward so that you're meeting the needs of other people, right? That could be a lot of things, but it certainly isn't greedy. Now, what about socialism? What does socialism do? Well, socialism does just the opposite. It focuses you back in on yourself. How does it do that? Well, you're always competing with everybody else to get the most you can from a limited supply of goods or services that the government decides to make available. So if you're standing in line for gasoline or for government rationed health care, or if you're in one of the traditional food lines that they always have in socialist countries, because socialist countries never generate enough food to feed everybody, if you're standing in a food line, you're not thinking about the person in front of you or behind you and how to feed them. You're not thinking what kind of food they might want. You're thinking about how you can get the most for yourself when you get to the end of that line. And how do you get the most for yourself in a socialist economy? Well, you do it by pleasing the government elites, right? They're the ones who control the economy. So now you're not trying to please consumers, you're trying to please government elites. And there's always a very small amount of them. So if you're willing to become one or make yourself useful to them, you can get more for yourself. But there's generally very little wealth. Think about North Korea. North Korea, the people are starving. There's no consumer goods. I mean, people are starving, right? Well, what about Kim Jong-un? Does it look like this guy's missed a meal? Or how about Venezuela? Venezuela, the people are literally eating their pets. They're dumping garbage out and selling the plastic bags. They're spreading disease throughout South America into Colombia and Brazil. Does it look like Maduro and his military friends and his buddies are eating their pets? I don't think so. That's because in a socialist economy, everything goes to the people who control the economy, which is the government elites. Venezuela, by the way, in 2011 was the richest country in South America. Venezuela sits literally on an ocean of oil. Now, how do you sit on an ocean of oil and have your people starving and eating their pets? Well, I'll tell you how. This is Caracas. This is the benevolence of socialism. Now, to hide this, you can't. You look back historically, you can't really hide what happened with the Soviet Union. You cannot educate kids about it, but you can't hide it. And you can look at Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela. You can't deny that people are starving, that it's a mess. They're the worst economies in the world. So the socialists are out there, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, saying we're not that kind of socialism. We're not North Korea. We're not Cuba. We're not the Soviet Union. We're Denmark, right? We're Denmark. There is a problem with that. The problem is that Denmark is a free market capitalist economy. In fact, in 2016, when Bernie Sanders was running around the country saying we're Denmark, the Danes got a little irritated. So they had their prime minister came over to the United States, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and spoke at Harvard. And he said, for all to see, I know that some people in the U.S. associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I'd like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. And in fact, the Heritage Foundation comes out with an index of economic freedom each year that lists countries from the most free to the least free. It ranks 180 countries. And by the way, the least free are North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela. But number 12 is the United States. Denmark's number 14. I mean, they are comparably free. Now, Denmark does have a very generous welfare system. And that alone should tell you that they're a capitalist free market economy, because a socialist economy never could afford to have a generous welfare system because they couldn't pay for it. Now, we can debate whether that's a good idea or not. It discourages work. They don't have economic growth like we have. They don't really pay their fair share of their military defense. They rely on us and NATO. But nonetheless, they are a free market capitalist economy, and if Bernie Sanders or AOC try and tell you something else, just tell the people that are telling you that they're wrong and they're a liar, and pull up the Lars Loki Rasmussen quote. All right, so we know socialism, wherever it's tried, whenever it's tried, fails. People starve, the government elites get all the money, it's not a good thing. But what about capitalism? Well, you know from those pictures of the grocery store and the Amazon warehouse, capitalism creates abundance. It creates prosperity. But does it reach the common man and the common woman? Let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to show you a chart in a minute that was prepared based on data that a guy named Angus Maddison produced. He's a British historical economist. And he looked at the sweep of world economic history going back to the year zero, so 2,000 years here. And he measured it by GDP per capita. All right, as most of you probably know, GDP is economic output, and per capita just means per person. Now, why they call it GDP per capita and not just economic output per person, I can't tell you. Maybe they want to look smarter than they are, but it's basically just economic output per person. And you can see that around 1800, something spectacular happened. Jonathan Haidt, who teaches at NYU, called this the most important graph in the world, and he's absolutely right. And this was originally published, by the way, in The Atlantic, which is not exactly a far-right magazine. It shoots up, and it impacted everybody in this room that shot up. It impacted your grandparents. It probably impacted your great-grandparents. It will impact you. It will impact your children and your grandchildren. World history changed, literally in the blink of an eye. Now, I showed this to a son of mine, who's now 26 or 27, so my wife would be mad I didn't know whether he's 26 or 20, but he's one of those two. But he's a millennial, and he said, Dad, you're going to tell me this is capitalism. It's not capitalism. That's the Industrial Revolution. I said, wrong. Let me show you another chart. This is a chart that takes that 200-year period, kind of spreads it out a little bit, and shows you where it happened by region. And the first place that went up was the United States. And it shot up, right? Shot up to the Civil War. Then we got rid of the feudal economic system in the South, and then it just shot straight up. Why did that happen? Well, two fortuitous coincidences. In 1776, we signed the Declaration of Independence, and a guy named Adam Smith published a book called The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations described why you would implement a modern capitalist economy and how you would do it. And the founders read it, and they implemented a modern-day capitalist economy. And in fact, within 100 years of the ratification of our Constitution, so from 1789 to 1885, a little less than 100 years, the blink of an eye historically, we went from being 13 backwoods colonies on the coast of North America to the world's largest economy. And we have been the world's largest economy ever since. Now, what about Great Britain? Great Britain, Western Europe, they had an industrial revolution. You can see the blue line goes up. If I had a pointer, I'd point at it. I don't think I have one here. Do I have? Anyway, you can see the blue line. It goes up, and then it just shoots up. Shoots up after World War II. Why would that be? Well, after World War II, there was the fall of the National Socialist Party. Now, those of you who went to a school where you actually learned some history would know that was the Nazi Party. A lot of times millennials are very surprised to find out that the Nazis were actually proud socialists. They weren't some far right-wing group. They were socialists. They collapsed. Western Europe shot up under the Marshall Plan with the help of the United States. How about Japan? This is the second most impressive line on this chart. Japan shoots up after World War II. They had a bit of an industrial revolution, but then they shot up. Why? Well, after World War II, General MacArthur went into Japan, and he set up a democracy, and guess what? A free market capitalist economy. And they passed Western Europe for the first time in history. Eastern Europe shoots up. When do they shoot up? The fall of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the fall of the USSR. How about China? China even shoots up, not as much as everybody else, but it's when they implemented red capitalism, got rid of the Maoist strict socialism. They put in this red cap. It's not even real capitalism, and they still go up. Capitalism did this. This wasn't just the Industrial Revolution. This was capitalism. Right? But did it reach ordinary people? This is an average, right? Did it reach ordinary people? Well, the World Bank is an institution that does a lot of studies on the world's economy. And they did a study going back to 1820 to measure how many people lived in extreme poverty through the last basically 200 years. This went through about 2015. And as you can see, back in 1820, when that line started to go up, 94 out of every 100 people lived in extreme poverty. That's a lot of people. Only 6 didn't live in extreme poverty, and probably 3 or 4 of those lived in just regular poverty. Now, if you don't think there was a lot of poverty back then, go read a book by Dickens. I mean, things were bad, right? It was not good. By 2015, that number is down to 9.6. They average it to 10. That was 4 years ago. It's probably single digits today. What caused that 84 percentage point drop? Right? Why did it drop 84 percentage points? Well, this chart looked to me like it might correlate pretty well with the GDP per capita chart that showed what capitalism did to GDP per capita. This seemed to indicate that maybe it was also lifting people out of poverty. So I found a friend of mine, he's kind of a techie, and he does a lot of this kind of analysis, and I asked him to take the 2 databases and prepare a chart that showed whether they correlate. And in fact, he said he'd never seen a correlation so close. The blue line is what capitalism did to GDP per capita. The red line is what capitalism did to extreme poverty. You only see this chart here because it's my chart. I had a guy prepare it for me. In any event, it was fairly convincing to me, but I'll give you one more chart that you can look at. This is a chart as to what's happened to the world since the fall of the Soviet Union. It was put together by an Austrian historian using World Bank data. And you can see that what happened with Hungary, poverty, pollution, illiteracy, and child mortality since the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell in 1991. This chart goes back to 1990. They all dropped like a rock. Look at that red line. Look at poverty, right? Fewer people starving to death. Poverty dropping. Fewer dead children. Now, that's the benevolence of capitalism. What this chart doesn't tell you is, at the beginning of this chart, there were 2 billion fewer people than at the end of the chart. So as the populations increased, despite the increase in the number of people living in the world, there's been this incredible reduction in poverty, incredible reduction in starvation, and an incredible uplifting of people's health. Fewer babies dying. That's the benevolence of capitalism. Now, a lot of times people say, well, why is this happening? What is this about? Well, it shows you the difference between 2 basic approaches to economic theory. One of them is the belief that a rising tide lifts all boats. That's a statement that was made by President John F. Kennedy back in the early 60s when he was trying to get tax cuts passed because he believed that cutting taxes would generate economic growth. There had been a number of recessions in the 50s, and he wanted to put an end to it. And he argued that a rising economic tide lifts all boats, meaning that a growing economy may make the rich richer, but it makes the middle class richer. It makes the working class richer. It makes the poor richer. It makes everybody richer, which is, he would never get nominated. He couldn't even be on the debate stage today, right? Thank God. But at least it proves he's sane. I mean, you couldn't even be on the Democratic debate stage because today, if you don't accept the fact that wealth is a zero-sum game, you can't run for the Democratic nomination for anything. And what do I mean by wealth is a zero-sum game? Well, what socialists believe, and this is the justification for their redistribution, they believe that the rich only get richer if the poor get poorer, and that the poor only get richer if the rich get poorer. So they have to redistribute income to fix everything. They don't believe that economic growth benefits everybody. And you could see it during the Obama years. Right? It's kind of embarrassing. They were predicting they'd have 4% GDP growth. They never even had a year of 3% GDP growth. If you look at Obama's last year in office, 2016, GDP growth was 1.6%. Trump's first year in office, after he cut taxes, reduced regulations, focused on domestic energy, when he went to capitalist free market policies, GDP grew to 2.9%. That's an 80% improvement in GDP. And who benefits? Well, we know everybody benefits, right? I mean, because we saw it on the charts. We've got more people working than have ever worked in the history of the country. We have an unemployment rate that's at a 50-year low. I was 19 years old the last time, just to give you an idea how ridiculous this is. I was 19 years old the last time the unemployment rate was this low. And who does it benefit? Well, we've hit historic lows in unemployment for African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, women, people with only a high school education, veterans, the disabled. That's a lot of people. And what happens when you have very few people unemployed? Well, it drives wages up because employers compete for employees. When employees compete with each other for jobs, none of them get paid anymore. When employers are competing for employees, try and get somebody to do some work on your house. I mean, there's just nobody out there to do anything. Everybody's competing to get employees, and it's driving wages up. We had 91 consecutive months under President Obama where wage growth never hit 3% in any month, year-over-year wage growth. We just finished our 10th month in a row under President Trump where it did hit 3%. And for retail workers, low-paid workers, it's been at 3.8% or better for 14 months. For people who work in restaurants and hotels, it's been 4% or better for 8 months. And in February and in May, it was 4.7%. This is hitting everybody. It's now harder to find a blue-collar worker in America than it is to find a white-collar worker. Well, why would that be? Well, when President Obama left office with all his massive regulations and his massive federal programs and his increasing taxes, there were 2 million more people unemployed than we had job openings, right? Because the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures both. So 2 million more people unemployed than jobs open. Today, 1.3 million more job openings than people unemployed. That's a complete turnaround. That's why I called my book The Capitalist Comeback, which, by the way, I'm not going to make a nickel on. I'm not going to be like Bernie Sanders and come in and say, well, I'm not ashamed that I wrote a book that made money. Well, I'm not ashamed of it either, but I'm going to donate the money to a charity that encourages entrepreneurship in minority communities, because my point wasn't to make money with the book, it was to get the message out. But it was a true comeback. It's a 180-degree turn, right? We've gone from an economy within 2 years, just like that chart shot straight up. Within 2 years, we went from an economy where the biggest problem facing this country was too many unemployed people and not enough jobs, to an economy where the biggest problem is that businesses can't find enough people to fill the open good quality jobs. So what I tell millennials at this point is that I have very good news for you. The good news is that the economic system under which you have lived is the best system ever devised in the history of humankind. And if you're concerned about your future or the future of those around you, capitalism is the best way to create prosperity. It empowers our farmers to feed the world, because by feeding the world, they can better feed themselves and their families. It empowers our entrepreneurs to rebuild our cities, because by opening hotels and apartment buildings and restaurants and grocery stores, they can lift their communities and lift themselves. It's the best system ever devised for empowering the poor and the marginalized. It empowers them as consumers who vote with every dollar they spend, and it creates the opportunities that can lift them economically, and it can lift you economically. The system's called capitalism, and what it created was the American dream. Now, whether or not millennials will defend the American dream, whether they will take the political liberties that they've inherited and the economic freedoms and pass them on to the next generation in as good or better shape than they received them, that's completely up to the millennials. As Ronald Reagan famously said, freedom is but one generation away from extinction. Are millennials going to be that generation that allows our freedoms and our liberties to be extinguished? Again, it's their call. But we can do things. We can inform them. We can educate them. We can tell them the things that their professors and Hollywood elites don't want them to know. That capitalism is the only system that has ever meaningfully lifted people out of poverty, and it's lifted billions of people out of poverty. That it is a compassionate system, it is a benevolent system, it is a moral system, and it's right. Now we can pray. We can pray that God will grant this generation wisdom, that he will guide them as they assume the mantle of protecting the most exceptional nation that's ever existed in the history of the world. And may God bless all of you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you. Thank you. So I said I'd be happy to take questions, and I am. I don't know if there are microphones, or there is a microphone. And one over here, there's two microphones, okay.
One thing you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation was the primacy of free markets being the driver for that growth. So I was wondering, how do you reconcile those two different parts of your arguments with the idea that Trump has imposed many tariffs on different sectors of imports into our country?
Well, the tariff question is more complicated than you might think. I happen to be a free trader. I believe more trade is better than less trade, and that will help economic development. But I have to tell you, it isn't free trade if it isn't fair trade. You know, if one party's cheating, there's nothing fair about it. And if you've got a party out there that's manipulating its currency so it can ship goods cheaply into this country to put our businesses out of business, that's not fair competition. If it's stealing our intellectual property, if it's engaging in cyber attacks to try and get our national security secrets and our technological secrets, that's just not fair. So, you know, there was during the lead up to the 2016 election, Barack Obama went on TV and said, you know, Trump's out there saying he's going to get these better trade deals. Well, what magic wand does he have to do that? Well, the magic wand is tariffs. You know, China needs our business a whole lot more than we need their business. And if you don't believe that, look at economic growth in this country over the past few quarters and look at economic growth in China. China's faltering for the first time in decades because they can no longer take advantage of the United States. So I think we absolutely should have free trade, but it has to be fair trade. You know, if you're selling cars, if you're running Ford Motor Company, you got to pay 25% tariff, or you did before this, the tariff fights. Now it's 15, but you got to pay a 25% tariff to sell a Ford in Beijing, right? But if Beijing made a car, they could sell it here for a 2.5% tariff. If you're in Berlin, you could sell a Ford in Berlin, but you'd have to pay a 10% tariff. But to sell a Mercedes in Detroit, they only had to pay a 2.5% tariff. If I was running a Ford Motor Company, I think I'd feel like I was being cheated. I mean, what's fair about that? Like, how is that good for the country? How is that good for trade? There's nothing free and fair about that. We're getting cheated. And we finally have a president that's willing to stand up and say, enough is enough. We're not doing this anymore. And I back him up. I believe what he's doing is the right thing. And I think at the end of it, we'll have freer and fairer trade, and we'll have more trade. But we have to go through a period of time where we show them we're tough. We show them we're not going to back off.
Let's talk about motivation. Why? I don't get it. I get why somebody wants to be wealthier, so the profit motive. Why do these people want to be less wealthy? Is it simply because Jeff Bezos has so much money that it's not fair? I mean, I have a tough time explaining the motivation to my wife or to anybody else that wants to listen when you want to throw something at the TV during the debates.
I think they just don't get it. I think they've been so indoctrinated in the notion that if you say you're a capitalist, you're greedy, that it's hard for them to adjust to the fact that, in fact, capitalism is the least greedy system out there. I don't think they really understand that socialism, I mean, how could Bernie Sanders stand up and talk about Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, health, free educations, free this, free that. You know, we took in $3.3 million in revenue last year in this country. We spent 4.1. So we spent 800,000 more than we brought in. According to a conservative estimate of what it would cost to implement just Medicare for all, forget everything else, just Medicare for all would be $3.26 trillion on top of what we already spent. So you took the 4.1, right? You spent another 3.26, so now you've got 7.36, right? It's like $7.4 trillion. But we only had 3.3 trillion in revenue. So his response is tax the rich, right? Do you know how much the rich earned last year in total? For everybody who made $500,000 or above, that's the top tax bracket, $500,000 and above, total income was $2 trillion. You could take everything that the top, the big earners, high earners earned last year. You could add it to everything we collected last year, and you still only have $5.3 trillion to cover $3 trillion, and you haven't even gone on to this Green New Deal baloney or the paying for everybody's college or buying everybody tennis shoes and iPhones. I don't know what he's going to buy them, whatever they're. I feel like I should say to millennials, you really should support free markets because it has the word free in it. And you really seem to like free, right? So I don't get it. That's why I give these talks. I said, really, people just must not understand what's going on, and I think people buy into that myth. That myth that socialism is necessary and desirable to protect the oppressed masses from capitalist greed. You're told that since the time you're 5 years old. By the time you get out of high school or college, you get smattered in college. I mean, college, it's ridiculous. I have a son at Washington University. He'll be a senior this year. He said he's going to have to go into politics because he's afraid we're going to lose the country. I mean, so it's tough. I don't get it either. That's my answer. How about somebody on this side? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Trenton Morgan from Oklahoma. I just wanted to ask what your opinion is on free market economy and the ability for monopolies to form, and if you think that they're beneficial.
I'm sorry, you have to say that again. Free market economy and what?
The abilities for monopolies to form within them, and if that's beneficial.
Well, monopolies are illegal. I mean, you can't have a monopoly. You can't have Standard Oil controlled 90% of petroleum in this country, and in areas where they had small competitors, they would lower their prices to drive them out of business, and in places where they didn't have competition, they'd raise prices. This is kind of what we're trying to do to avoid a problem with China, where they control products in this country and they can mess with pricing. So it's illegal to have a monopoly. You shouldn't have a monopoly. We have protections against that. The problem with Facebook and Google, for example, or Twitter, they don't charge anything. It's not like they could go and charge more in New York and less in Cleveland. They don't charge anything. So it's kind of hard to get a handle on it. It's also tough because one of the advantages that China has over us is that China amasses this huge amount of personal data. They don't care about privacy. They don't care about competition. The government just amasses this huge, and they may even have our data, right? Because they hacked in and got our data. They may have more than our country has about us. They have this huge amount of data, data is value. Data is gold. Data is everything. Because you can get better health outcomes if you have masses of data. I mean, there are many things you can do with data that can advance your society and advance your position in the world. So it's really kind of tough because you sort of want these giant corporations that we have that are amassing this data to have the data for some things, but you don't want them to use it to oppress us. You don't want them to be able to censor material. For example, Google calling Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson Nazis. I mean, it's just stupid. I mean, two of them are Jewish. I mean, it's ridiculous. But you watched the debates last night and you can understand. Anyway, so that's what I think about monopolies. Who's got a microphone?
Hi, I had a question for you about corporate interest in politics currently. So right now when corporate interest has that privilege that they're given by government, it is a threat to a free market and it makes it unfair for consumers, which I think is possibly a reason why there's this big push for a free healthcare, because right now it's very unaffordable. So what would you propose to take that corporate interest out of government right now to make the market more free?
Well, it's a little hard to say unless you give me examples. The one thing you did mention was healthcare, and I would say that I mean there was a big debate about whether healthcare is a right and everybody should have healthcare, and there's all these companies making all this money off of healthcare. But you and I could probably agree that what we really want is better quality healthcare at a lower price, right? Okay. There's only been one thing in the history of the world, one thing ever, that has increased quality and decreased price. You know what that is? It's competition. There's nothing else that increases quality and decreases price. What do you know about when you get the government involved in something? You know, the price is going to go up and the quality is going to come down. This is why people from all over the world come to the United States for health care. So I think the problem is that we have a system that isn't set up very well. You've got the people who get insurance coverage, right? Like you and I would, when we go to the doctor's office, we don't care if the flu shot costs $30 or you get it for $5 at CVS. Who cares? Insurance is going to pay for it. You don't even look, right? So you're not watching it. You're not paying attention to what people are charging you. So that takes kind of a competitive element out. The insurance companies then try and screw the doctors to get the doctors to drive their prices down. Doctors rebel against that. We really don't have a very good system right now for healthcare, but it isn't a system where we should say drug companies can't make a profit, insurance companies can't make a profit. It's where we should enable them to compete, and we, as the recipients of their services, should be trying to get the best deals we can from them. The insurance companies in the middle kind of screwed that up. There's a perfect example of how this works. It's Singapore, where doctors have to publish their prices, and they get rated like Uber drivers, right? And then they have to publish what they charge for different procedures. And people have health savings accounts where they actually can leave it to their kids. They can put their own money in. They build it up, and when they die, their children can inherit it, and they can only use it for to cover health costs. So people always have an incentive. They also have insurance, which covers the majority of it, but they never have 100% insurance coverage. So you've always got an iron in the fire, right? You're always trying to keep the price down. And Singapore, in fact, has the lowest percentage of GDP per capita spent on healthcare and the best health results in the world. Procedures that cost $150,000 in the United States cost $20,000 in Singapore. I mean, so there are examples of how you can do this right. The solution isn't, I don't know of America, our company had no big advantage from the government. We didn't have anything to do with the government. Now, there are times when the government incentivizes companies. For example, they wanted to, at one point in our history, incentivize oil companies to go out and drill for oil, so they gave them advantages if they went out and drilled for oil. That's no longer something that we need to encourage them to do because there's a ton of oil out there. This is at a time when we didn't think there was any. We're going to run out of oil. So maybe the incentive should go away, but when you get something from the government, it's like what was it, who said this? The only things that are eternal are God and a government program. And we need to kill some of these government programs, but that's what our elected officials should be doing. They shouldn't be handing out corporate welfare. So I agree with you in that sense. I don't have the microphone. I can't pick.
Hello. Is this working? Okay, awesome. So I wanted to ask a question about taxes and the increasing wealth gap. I know people back home who are interested in supporting Democratic candidates since they are concerned about the increasing wealth gap, since it's
you're talking about the income inequality gap?
Yes, income inequality gap, and how it's the largest it has been since the 1920s. I was wondering, do you think that decreasing taxes would help fix this? And if not, what would? Okay,
so that's a figure that Bernie Sanders uses. And I just had an article in the Wall Street Journal that talks about this. The way Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez measure income inequality is based on a study by a guy named Saez, S-A-E-Z, out of Berkeley. And he measures income inequality by looking at pre-tax income before government benefits. What does that mean? Well, he looks at gross income, not reduced by taxes. And by the way, the top 10% pay 70% of our income taxes. The top 20% of people pay 90% of income taxes. So they ignore what reduces taxes at the top. And then they ignore the transfer of those monies to people at the bottom through welfare programs, such as Section 8 housing, food stamps, Social Security, what's the other one? Oh, Medicare, Medicaid. They ignore those payments, and they ignore taxes. So yeah, if you ignore those things, the gap between the wealthy and the poor is going to be it's going to be pretty big, right? But the fact of the matter is we have taxes and we have welfare benefit programs. There was a study done by a person from the committee on, the Joint Committee on Taxation in Congress and somebody out of the IRS, a widely cited study that doesn't get reported very much, that also examined wealth inequality and found that if you consider taxes and you consider these wealth distribution programs that the government has, government transfers, the change in inequality has been less than 0.5%. It's like less than a rounding error. So the interesting thing about that is if you increase taxes to 90%, right, and transferred all the money to people at the bottom, the way they measure income inequality, it wouldn't change it at all because they ignore taxes and they ignore the government transfers. So they're measuring it in a very, very unfair way. Now, I will say Some income inequality is good. There should be income inequality. Like Jeff Bezos, somebody mentioned him, he's super rich. Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs, these guys didn't get rich by cheating us. They didn't get rich by stealing from us. They got rich because they provided disproportionate benefits. They got disproportionate wealth because they provided disproportionate benefits. In a capitalist society, you benefit to the extent that you are able to benefit other people. You know, for example, I ran a company that had 115,000 employees. I took it essentially from bankruptcy to a profitable company. That saved 115,000 jobs. It saved a lot of franchisees their life savings. It created a company that continues on. That's worth more than the guy that mops the floor. Nothing wrong with the guy. I used to be the guy who mopped the floor. There's nothing wrong with that. But you benefit to the extent that you provide a benefit. And that's why we do so well. That's what creates abundance and prosperity. You know, people will take a risk if there's a big reward. You know, the best way to think about this, think about the lottery. You know, when it's the regular lottery, how many guys do you see or gals do you see, you know, in the local convenience, the 7-Eleven, buying lottery tickets? Well, maybe you see a couple. But if you're from a state that has the Powerball, right? How about that number gets up to 100 million? The people are flocking in the store. The odds are worse, right? The odds are worse that you will win. But everybody wants a ticket because you're willing to take risks for big rewards. That's why this country produces such incredible wealth, and companies like Amazon, because a guy like Jeff Bezos is willing to take those risks. You know, 15 years ago, you could have bought Amazon stock for nothing. I mean, it was a few bucks. Now it's like almost $2,000 a share. Well, Jeff Bezos risked his whole fortune, his future, his family, everything on Amazon succeeding. And he won the bet. And we all won the bet. Who in this room hasn't used Amazon? You know, seriously, this is the best distribution system created in the history of the world. There's never been a person that's developed a system this good, a state, a country, a company. Nobody's ever developed a system like this. He ought to be the most richest guy. As far as I'm concerned, I don't resent it at all. I also didn't resent the fact that Steve Jobs, you know, everybody says you resent the fact that Steve Jobs made 50 cents on every iPhone. Well, personally, I wouldn't resent it. I have an iPhone in my back pocket, and I really love my iPhone. It now controls my life. I mean, I do everything on my iPhone. I wouldn't even leave it on the table that somebody might, you know, I know even in this group of very honest capitalist people, I wouldn't even leave my phone on the table. I was afraid somebody'd take it. You know, that what happened to my life? But Jobs, in fact, didn't get 50 cents per iPhone. He owned Apple stock, right? And when Apple did very well, and this is a guy who started a business in his garage with a couple buddies. Well, you know, that's a lot of risk. And because he succeeded, he got a lot of reward. That doesn't bother me at all. I think that's how we move forward. That's why that line shoots up. How about this young lady in front? She'll never get a... Oh, Edith, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Then after Edith.
I heard a lecture by Michael Munger, a professor from Duke. He's written a book about the coming sharing economy, and he claims that transaction costs have come down so much that it's possible. He cites Uber as an example, and it's cheaper to share than to own. And he thinks that this is a revolution coming that's as great as the Industrial Revolution. Do you think there's any merit in his thinking?
You know, I know it's probably beyond my area of expertise,
Yeah.
but if you do think that, and you're in this room and you're young and you understand what Edith just said, or you understand what this guy was talking about, you should invest in companies that will do those things, because they will make you a lot of money. So you should risk your capital to try and help them succeed. That's why this country works.
Hello, thank you very much for speaking. My name's
Sure.
Emily. It was nice to meet you earlier. I was a benefactor of welfare benefits in high school. My family utilized food stamps and other such things. To be where I am now, I consider myself someone who's benefited greatly from great philanthropy, a capitalist system that allowed me to climb up in different jobs, and also welfare opportunities that helped my family when we were at our lowest. So do you think that an opportunity for compromise between Democrats and Republicans might be a free market economy, but with a more affordalized welfare system?
You know, there's a policy that Paul Ryan, Kevin's friend, and me, and Barack Obama and Warren Buffett all support. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. The problem with welfare now is that there are cliffs. So if you earn a certain amount of money, you lose your food stamps. If you earn a certain amount of money, you lose your housing. Matter of fact, when I was running Carl's, they raised the minimum wage in California, I think it was to $12, or it was $10. I can't remember. It was one of those two. And I used to have dinners with managers and district managers in our restaurants. And one night I had a dinner in LA after the minimum wage went up. And I said, so guys, and gals, what's the biggest problem you're facing? And I said, well, people won't work the hours in our stores. We can't get people to work full schedules. I said, well, why on earth wouldn't people work full schedules? They just got a raise. Minimum wage, you're making 10 or 12, so everybody else is making more. They come in and they say, oh, we can't work those hours because if we work those hours, we lose our Section 8 housing, we lose our food stamps, we lose our Medicare. They actually make less money the more they earn. That's the problem with our current welfare system. Our welfare system should be a way that lifts people out of poverty, not one that makes the gap between poverty and success too big to bridge. And that's what welfare often does now. There's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a basic supplement. If you have a job, we'll pay it eliminates the other welfare programs, but we pay a supplement to people that have jobs so that their incomes come up to a level that's acceptable. And the more they work, the smaller the benefit. But the benefit never decreases more than their income increases. So eventually they work themselves off of welfare, but they never face the cliff. They always benefit from making more money. Right now, we have this idiotic system that the Democrats won't let us touch with a 10-foot pole that holds people into poverty. And who do those people vote for? Well, I'll leave that to you. But right now, what we need to do is change that system for the better, where we can afford it, where it actually helps people, where it lifts them out of poverty and doesn't hold them in poverty. So I think a compromise like that, Republicans have been trying to pass that for a long time. And as I said, even President Obama liked it and expanded the program. Is that it? Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.